December 1944, Trois Ponts, Belgium. Look closely at this scene. This is no ordinary battlefield graveyard. Before you stand King Tigers and Panthers, 70-ton mechanical beasts that should be unstoppable. But they sit there silent, their guns cold, their engines dead. Completely intact, completely abandoned. On Christmas Eve, the elite spearhead of Joachim Peiper's SS Panzer force did the unthinkable. They cracked open the hatches of the most advanced tanks on Earth, climbed out, and fled into the frozen woods on foot. They left behind 135 armored vehicles worth a fortune in today's currency. 800 of Germany's most feared soldiers abandoned the pride of the Third Reich to rust in the snow, their blitzkrieg dream dying in a Belgian valley. What defeated this juggernaut? It wasn't Allied super-heavy tanks rolling in to meet them gun to gun. It wasn't a carpet bombing campaign that blotted out the sun. The collapse of Hitler's last great offensive began with a 50-cent piece of hemp rope and a trick so improvised, so insanely dangerous, it wasn't in any field manual. This is the story of the daisy chain, a weapon that sounds like cartoon warfare, but became the nightmare of the SS. It's a story about how a handful of desperate combat engineers, men who normally built bridges and cleared rubble, outsmarted the most technologically advanced armored force in history and turned Germany's lightning war into a frozen parking lot of death. To understand the genius of this makeshift weapon, you first have to understand the nightmare of the environment. Before we dive into this story, subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Every view helps bring more stories like this to life. December 1944 in the Ardennes wasn't just cold, it was lethal. Temperatures plunged below zero. The ground wasn't soil anymore. It was frozen into a substance as hard as granite, locked solid by weeks of brutal winter. And this geological fact is what terrified the men of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion. These men were not elite tank destroyers. They were builders. Their war was usually fought with shovels and bulldozers, constructing bridges and filling craters. But now, intelligence reported that Kampfgruppe Peiper was barreling toward them. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, the ruthless spearhead commander, was leading an armored column that stretched for miles through the forest. His mission was brutally simple: speed. He had to punch through to the Meuse River in days to split the Allied armies in half. Fuel was his blood. Momentum was his oxygen. If he stopped, the German offensive died. The engineers knew the standard military doctrine to stop a tank column: lay a minefield. You bury M1A1 anti-tank mines in a checkerboard pattern across the road, cover them with dirt, and wait for the enemy to roll over their own doom. But when the men of the 291st took their entrenching tools out to the roads near Trois Ponts, they hit a wall of reality. The metal shovels clanged against the earth with the sound of a hammer striking an anvil. Sparks actually flew from the frozen ground. They tried using pickaxes, but the shock waves jarred their bones, and they couldn't chip away more than an inch of ice. One soldier later recalled the shovels bouncing off the ground like stones on concrete. Imagine the panic setting in. You can hear the distant rumble of Maybach engines getting louder every minute, echoing through the black forest. You know that 70 tons of steel is coming to crush you. You have crates full of high-explosive anti-tank mines, but you can't use them because nature has locked the door. You can't bury the mines. If you leave them on the surface, German infantry will spot them immediately and kick them aside, or the drivers will simply steer around them. The engineers stood there freezing, exhausted, and effectively disarmed by the weather. The air was thick with the smell of nervous sweat, wet wool, and diesel fumes. They were staring at a death sentence. Behind them was the Meuse River and the last line of Allied defense. Ahead was the most feared panzer column in Europe, racing toward them through the snow. But desperation is the mother of invention. In a command tent, or perhaps in a frozen foxhole while fiddling with equipment, a question was asked. It wasn't a question about military tactics. It was a question of mechanics. A problem-solving question. If we can't hide the mine under the road, why don't we hide it beside the road? It was a ridiculous idea. It sounded like something out of a cartoon. But the logic held up. If the mine is on the road, the Germans see it. If the mine is in the ditch, it's useless. But what if the mine could move? The engineers began to experiment. They took the M1A1 mines, heavy steel discs packed with explosives, and looked for a way to mobilize them. They raided supply trucks and found coils of rough hemp rope. They found spools of field telephone wire. They began tying the mines together. One mine wasn't enough to guarantee a kill on a 70-ton Panther. So they strung 4 or 5 of them in a row, spaced about 5 feet apart, lashing rope around the carrying handles with heavy knots. When they dragged the assembly across the snow, the black mines looked like a dark necklace, a daisy chain. The plan was audacious. They would hide the chain of mines in snow-covered ditches or behind piles of rubble alongside the narrow Belgian roads. A soldier would crouch in a foxhole 15 to 20 yards away, gripping the end of the rope. He would wait for the Panther tank to roll right in front of him, and then yank the mines directly under its tracks. But as the men practiced this motion in the frozen fields, the reality of what they were proposing began to sink in. This wasn't just laying a trap and walking away. This was a duel. To make this work, an American combat engineer, a man trained to build, not fight, would have to let a Panther tank, a machine designed to annihilate everything in its path, drive within arm's reach of his hiding spot. He would have to stay perfectly still while the ground shook, while the exhaust fumes filled his lungs, while the treads churned ice and mud just feet from his face. And then, at the last possible second, he would have to pull. The Ardennes in December 1944 was a landscape designed to kill. Black forests pressed in from all sides, their skeletal branches heavy with ice. Frozen rivers lay like white scars across the valley floor. Ridges rose sharp and hostile against gray skies. The silence was absolute until it wasn't. Then you'd hear it. The distant growl of engines echoing through the trees like approaching thunder. The men of the 291st weren't supposed to be here. They weren't hardened infantry who'd trained for this moment. They were construction workers in uniform. Farm boys, mechanics, college kids who'd learned to drive bulldozers and string barbed wire. Now they stood as the last line of defense between Piper and the Meuse River, and every man knew it. Their equipment mocked them. Shovels struck frozen earth and sent sparks flying. Pickaxes rang like bells and bounced back, jarring bones. The ground might as well have been solid concrete. They couldn't dig. They couldn't bury mines. Standard doctrine was useless. Then the rumors started spreading down the line. Kampfgruppe Piper, SS, Panthers and King Tigers. Miles of armor moving fast. Piper's reputation preceded him. Ruthless, unstoppable, racing against the clock to reach the Meuse. If he crossed that river, the Allied armies would be cut in two. The war could turn on this single thrust. Without a minefield, the engineers had nothing. No way to slow the panzers. No way to channel them into kill zones. And then, cutting through the frozen air, came the sound they'd been dreading. The rumble of Maybach engines, distant but growing louder, echoing through the trees like a death sentence rolling toward them. Inside a cramped command tent lit by a single kerosene lantern, someone asked the question that would change everything. What if the mine could move? It sounded insane. But desperate men don't dismiss insane ideas. They test them. The engineers hauled out M1A1 anti-tank mines, heavy steel discs packed with 6 pounds of TNT. They scrounged coils of rough hemp rope from supply trucks, along with spools of black telephone wire. In the freezing darkness, they began to experiment. First attempt. Tie 2 mines together. Drag them across the snow, too sluggish. They added more rope, adjusted the knots, tied the cordage around the carrying handles. One engineer suggested spacing them out, 5 feet apart, maybe 6. That way, even if the first mine missed the track, the second or third would catch it. They worked methodically, freezing fingers fumbling with knots. 4 mines, 5. Strung together in a line, the black discs looked like a dark steel necklace, a daisy chain of death. Now came the hard part, testing the pull. They practiced in an open field, one man hiding in a shallow depression while others walked past, simulating a tank's approach. Pull too early, you miss. Pull too late, you're dead. The timing had to be perfect. Wait until the beast was right on top of you, then yank with everything you had. This feels like something out of a cartoon, one soldier muttered, his breath fogging in the cold. Nobody laughed. A young engineer stood alone afterward, staring at the rope in his hands. The reality was sinking in. To make this work, he'd have to let a 70-ton Panther roll within arm's reach before pulling the trigger. This wasn't just dangerous. It was nearly suicidal. The thunder came first, a deep mechanical rumble that shook the frozen earth. Piper's armored spearhead was closing in, and you could feel it in your bones before you saw anything. The sound of dozens of engines, grinding treads, and clanking metal echoed through the Ardennes like an approaching avalanche. German scouts appeared first, moving cautiously down the narrow Belgian roads with mine detectors. They swept the pavement methodically, side to side, searching for buried charges. Their instruments hummed and clicked. They found nothing. The detectors never touched the ditches, never even glanced at the snow-covered slopes where the real threat lay hidden. Behind them, the engineers of the 291st worked frantically. They positioned daisy chains along choke points, burying the ropes under snow, marking their positions with small stones only they would recognize. A young private sat in a foxhole, pencil trembling as he wrote a final letter home. Another engineer crouched nearby, staring at his hands, shaking uncontrollably, willing them to be still. Snow began to fall again, fat flakes drifting down in silence, muffling every sound. It created a deceptive calm, beautiful and deadly. An officer moved down the line, his voice quiet but firm. If this doesn't work, there's nothing else between them and the Muse. We're it. The engineers took their positions. They lay in frozen ditches, covered in white camouflage, gripping their ropes with numb fingers. And then, through the curtain of falling snow and skeletal trees, the first Panthers appeared. Dark shapes moving like predators through the forest, hatches closed, guns forward, unstoppable. Early afternoon, December 18th. 8 Panthers rolled toward Trois Ponts in a tight column, their commanders confident, their guns traversing slowly across the winter landscape. Hidden in his foxhole, a young engineer watched the lead tank approach. His entire world narrowed to a single point, the rope in his frozen hands. Closer, closer. The Panther's treads churned snow and ice, throwing up clouds of white powder. The ground shook. Exhaust fumes washed over him. Now. He yanked with everything he had. The daisy chain shot across the road like a black whip. 5 mines slid directly under the Panther's right track, and the world exploded. The blast was catastrophic. The Panther lurched violently to the side, its track shredded into twisted metal ribbons. The machine slewed sideways, blocking the entire road, smoke pouring from its wheels. A nearby 57mm anti-tank gun crew seized the moment. One shot, a lucky penetration into the crippled tank's side armor. The Panther erupted in flames. German return fire was immediate and merciless. The gun crew disappeared in a hail of machine gun tracers, their sacrifice buying precious seconds. Behind the burning lead tank, the second Panther tried to maneuver around, but clipped the wreckage. It too ground to a halt, damaged or trapped. The entire column stopped, 8 tanks frozen in place on a narrow road with nowhere to go. In the ditches, engineers stared at each other in wild disbelief. The insane plan had worked. But this was only the beginning. German commanders barked orders. Infantry dismounted. The column would push forward. But now, cautiously, fear spreading through their ranks like ice water. After the first strike, everything changed. The German advance slowed to a crawl. Tank commanders who'd been racing toward the Meuse now crept forward at walking speed, hatches open, eyes scanning for threats. Every bump in the road caused a halt. Every shadow triggered suspicion. Crews dismounted repeatedly to inspect tire ruts, snowdrifts, anything that looked remotely suspicious. Panzer grenadiers swept the road surface with detectors, methodically checking every inch of pavement. But they never looked at the ditches, the perfect blind spot. Their training said mines were buried in roads, not hidden beside them. Then came the masterstroke of psychological warfare. Near Stavlot, an engineer dragged a plain rope across the road, no mines attached, and disappeared into the woods. When the lead Panther spotted the rope lying in the snow, the entire column ground to a halt. Officers shouted. Infantry fanned out. Engineers were called forward to investigate. It took them 45 minutes to determine the rope was harmless. 45 minutes of burning fuel. 45 minutes closer to empty tanks. German officers grew livid. Piper's carefully calculated timetable was disintegrating. Every delay consumed precious gasoline, engines idling, heaters running, momentum bleeding away. The American engineers exploited this fear mercilessly. Real daisy chains, fake daisy chains, ropes with no mines, mines with tripwires. The Germans couldn't tell which was which, so they treated every suspicious object as lethal. Blitzkrieg momentum, the Nazi war machine's greatest strength, was dying. Miles behind the stalled column, Piper raged at his officers, demanding speed. He had no idea that small groups of unseen engineers with 50-cent rope were systematically crippling his entire offensive. The German war machine ran on 2 things, speed and gasoline. Now both were gone. With every delay, fuel gauges dropped. Engines idled for hours in the freezing cold, heaters running to keep crews from freezing, treads spinning uselessly in snow and mud. Tanks began sputtering and dying, abandoned where they stopped, transformed from weapons into obstacles. Behind the spearhead, the supply chain collapsed. Ammunition trucks couldn't navigate roads clogged with disabled armor. Fuel tankers sat miles back, unable to reach the front. Resupply became impossible. German soldiers, elite SS troops who'd begun the offensive with confidence, now huddled in frozen vehicles, exhausted and starving. They watched American positions through their scopes and began to understand. The offensive was failing. Not from superior firepower, but from simple arithmetic. Too many delays, too little fuel, too much time wasted. Piper pushed forward desperately, screaming orders, demanding his men break through. But every road was a graveyard of steel. Disabled Panthers, abandoned half-tracks, King Tigers sitting silent, their fuel tanks bone dry. The American engineers never stopped. More daisy chains, sniper fire from tree lines, small arms harassment, anything to keep the column stalled. By the third day, December 21st, Piper's spearhead was trapped in a narrow valley near La Glaise. No path forward through American defenses, no fuel to retreat. The most feared armored column in Europe sat immobile, a sitting target stretched along a single road. And then, on the morning of December 23rd, something changed. The clouds began to break. Sunlight pierced through. The skies were clearing. December 23rd, morning. For the first time in days, sunlight hit the snow. The clouds that had shielded Piper's column rolled away, revealing crystal blue skies. German crews looked up with dread. They knew what clear weather meant. Then came the sound, distant at first, then growing into a roar that filled the valley. P-47 thunderbolts, dozens of them, silver shapes glinting in the winter sun. German crews scrambled. Some tried to start frozen engines. Others abandoned their tanks and sprinted for the tree line. But there was no cover. The narrow valley had become a shooting gallery, and the immobilized panzers were targets on a firing range. The thunderbolts screamed down in steep dives, rockets trailing smoke, 500-pound bombs tumbling through the air. The valley erupted in fire and thunder. A King Tiger exploded, its ammunition cooking off in a secondary blast that sent the turret cartwheeling through the air. A Panther burst into flames, black smoke pouring skyward. Another tank, another. One by one they died, each explosion echoing off the frozen hills. Tracer fire cut through the smoke like deadly ribbons of light. German troops scattered into the woods, discipline dissolving into pure panic. Men who'd marched with confidence days ago now fled for their lives. From their positions on the ridgeline, the American engineers watched in awe as Allied air power finished what their ropes had begun. In his command half-track, Piper stared at the inferno consuming his column. His timetable was shattered. His fuel was gone. His dream of reaching the Meuse had died in this frozen Belgian valley, defeated by rope, weather, and now fire from above. Christmas Eve, in 44. Piper gave the order no SS commander ever wanted to give. Abandon everything. Destroy the radios. Burn the maps. Spike the guns. Leave it all behind. 800 exhausted SS troops, Germany's finest, slipped into the forest on foot, leaving behind the pride of the Third Reich. They moved like ghosts through the snow, defeated not by superior armor, but by rope and desperation. When American forces entered the valley on Christmas morning, they found a graveyard of steel. King Tigers sat silent, engines still warm. Panthers rested on their sides. Half-tracks and support vehicles lined the roads like abandoned toys. 135 armored vehicles, intact, loaded, and utterly useless. The engineers of the 291st walked among the hulks in stunned silence. These men, builders, not warriors, had done this. Their improvised invention, born of frozen ground and desperation, had changed the course of the battle. The irony was almost unbearable. The most technologically advanced armored column in the world, armed with the best tanks ever built, had been defeated by a 50-cent piece of rope, human ingenuity, and suicidal courage. Snow began to fall again, soft and silent, covering the abandoned King Tigers in white. Somewhere beneath the drifts lay the daisy chain mines, black steel necklaces that had stopped an army. The valley fell quiet, peaceful at last. In the end, the Battle of the Bulge taught a lesson as old as warfare itself. Brute force alone never wins. It's the human mind, creative, desperate, refusing to surrender, that turns the tide. Piper had speed, armor, and firepower, but he didn't have rope, and that made all the difference.